Question 57 features a cartoon in which a man handing out pamphlets is talking to a passerby who is holding one of these pamphlets, and there is a line that the man who has just received the pamphlet is saying. He's saying, I agree with you about capitalism, neocolonialism, and globalization, but I think you're being too hard on shopping. The question asks us, where is the source of the joke? Where is the humor coming from? Is it that the person does not agree with the pamphleteer about capitalism and globalization? Now, that would mean that the person would have to be lying, because what he does say is, I totally agree with you about capitalism, neocolonialism, and globalization. Is it that he is attempting to impress the pamphleteer but is saying the wrong thing? Now, he is politely disagreeing with the pamphleteer. So he may be doing that to impress him, but again, that is not the source of the joke. Is it B, that he does not intend to change his opinions on capitalism and globalization? It is not immediately obvious why he would change his opinions on capitalism and globalization, because he and the pamphleteer appear to agree on them, at least insofar as he is concerned. And this is not where the humor is coming from. Where the humor is coming from is his inability to associate shopping with capitalism and globalization. In other words, it's his inability to associate his own behavior with big phenomena such as capitalism and globalization. Now, the difference between big words like capitalism, neocolonialism, and globalization on the one hand, and on the other hand, a word like shopping, is that one describes these larger than life forces, and the other describes our everyday behavior. And the cartoonist is trying to point out our inability to perceive that the two are connected. Questions 58 to 62 are about a passage from a novel about an elderly woman, Miss Hare, who is awaiting the arrival of a housekeeper. And question 58 asks us what Mrs. Jolly, the idea of this housekeeper who she knows is going to be Mrs. Jolly, most significantly represents. Let's take a look at the options from the bottom up. Does Mrs. Jolly represent youthful energy? Now, we can see in the first paragraph that one of the things that Miss Hare is dreading is Mrs. Jolly's letters in the handwriting of daughters and nieces. This suggests that Mrs. Jolly can't be very young, because her daughters and nieces are obviously grown up and are living their own lives and are writing letters to her. So she seems like an older person herself, though perhaps not as old as Miss Hare. Is it that Miss Hare perceives Mrs. Jolly as a physical threat? There is simply no evidence of that in the text. Is it that she represents conformity and authority for Miss Hare? Now, the curious thing about this passage is that it actually tells us absolutely nothing about Mrs. Jolly and her character. Everything we read is about Miss Hare, her fears, her worries, her preferences, and so on. She seems a very self-engrossed character, and the passage conveys this quite well. So we don't know whether she would exude an air of conformity and authority. What we do know is that Miss Hare fears emotional contact with her. So A is your correct answer. We can see this in the first paragraph where it says that there would be this individual called Mrs. Jolly. You know, individuals are these people with their own preferences and feelings and so on. Her breathing would be heard, which suggests proximity that Miss Hare is uncomfortable with. And this handwriting of daughters and nieces telling of lives lived is also an unwelcome reminder that there are other people with their own lives and their own feelings, and that is what Miss Hare seems to fear. Question 59 asks us what the world beyond Xanadu was like for Miss Hare. Does it form a constraint from which she had escaped but wanted to rediscover, as D would suggest? Now, we get the sense that she hasn't so much escaped from the world as she had never had many dealings with it. The passage very much suggests that she's sort of always been in Xanadu, and there is no evidence that she wanted to rediscover it. More about this as we look at the other options. Is it B, a manifestation of superficiality and material greed? We get the sense that she dislikes the outside world because it contains human beings of whom she is scared, whom she dislikes, and whom she does not want to learn to love. That seems much more the reason why she avoids the world beyond Xanadu than anything like superficiality and material greed, of which there is no mention in the passage. Does she find the world beyond Xanadu intriguing yet threatening, as A suggests? Threatening strikes the right tone, but intriguing doesn't. There is no suggestion that she is intrigued by this world. She just wants to stay well away from it. The only plausible option is C, something to be sheltered from that was of no interest to her. We can see that she says, naturally, she found it impossible to like human beings, except for those who grew up in one's vicinity. So we can imagine that if there are children she sees from the comfort of her own garden or something, that's okay because she's in that safety of her world in Xanadu. But the idea of lives lived in other places is utterly frightening to her, as we can see in line 5. So she wants to be sheltered, protected from it, and she has no interest, as we can see towards the very end, in doing something like learning to love a human being, learning to establish contact with the outside world. So that is the best fit. Line 14 refers to Miss Hare's love as great but pitiable, and question 60 asks us why that is. Why is this love described using the word pitiable? Is it because D, she sought love through grief? Now, there is no evidence of grief being connected to love for Miss Hare. She does cry, that is mentioned, but the crying is about her loneliness and fear. It is not tied to love directly. Is it C, that her love was openly passionate and immature? Something that characterizes her love is restraint. She gives it only to those who don't expect it and can't give any love back. So this may or may not be immature, but it can hardly be characterized as passionate. Is it that B, she knew that other forms of love would elude her? The would elude seems very strangely phrased. Is it finally that A, her love was one-sided, making her experience incomplete? Now, we can see at the end of the second paragraph that she liked best those who never expected what they would not receive. So that's why she poured her love out onto animals, birds, and plants. She only loved creatures who did not have any expectations. Not only did they not love her back because they arguably were incapable of it, but they did not ask for anything back and did not ask, presumably, for more love. They simply expected nothing whatsoever of her, and that is what made her love, if you can call that love, possible. So the passage does suggest her experience is incomplete because of that one-sidedness, and therefore A is your correct answer. Question 61 asks for a sort of summary about Miss Hare and her world of Xanadu. And we can discard options A and D straight away because they immediately ring false. A suggests that the world of Xanadu is forbidding and punitive, and D suggests that she finds her existence in it unremittingly oppressive. Now, that is obviously the opposite of how she feels in this world. She feels safe. She feels protected by her solitude. She does not want to be intruded upon. She is finding the prospect of the housekeeper arriving unnerving. Our options are therefore B and C. And the question is whether Miss Hare acknowledges only the positive side of Xanadu. Now, it is true that it would be difficult to find her saying anything negative about it in this passage. However, she does cry sometimes. It does say not from grief because she found crying soothing. So I would hesitate to go for this option. I would move on and see if there is anything that fits the question better. And C, she has constructed a world that always agrees with her, is an excellent fit. Why is that? Because for one, it's a world in which she's completely alone. When you are completely alone, there is no one to disagree with. And also because we saw in the question about the great but pitiable love that she has constructed a world in which she could direct her affections, but in such a restricted, such a chosen way that fits her just so, that she has managed to avoid any kind of disagreement, tension, unpleasantness entirely. Therefore, this world that always agrees with her is the best fitting and the correct option. Question 62, the final question, is a technical one. It has to do with the fact that the author here uses something called free indirect speech, in which there is more than one voice, in this case, the voice of the narrator and the voice of Miss Hare herself, but there isn't anything like she thought or punctuation such as quotation marks to signal that change in voices. It is the meaning of the words themselves that lets us know that it is now the voice of Miss Hare, and then we are back to the voice of the narrator. So it's quite a subtle shift that is nonetheless usually perfectly, powerfully conveyed to the reader that we are unaware of. And question 62 is asking us to become aware of it and to figure out the style in which the changes in voice take place in this passage. Let's take a look briefly at paragraph 2 of this passage, because that is where this change in voice is most noticeable. Miss Hare often cried in private. This is the narrator talking. The next sentence says, "It was frightening though." And here we can almost hear the thoughts of Miss Hare. Here we have changed to Miss Hare's voice. The next sentence goes on, "Naturally, she found it impossible to like human beings." The question is, who is this natural to? Is this natural to the narrator? It's quite a strong and odd phrase, finding it impossible to like human beings. It is much more likely that it is Miss Hare telling herself. You can almost hear her thinking to herself, saying, naturally, human beings are impossible to like. So it's her quirky, very unusual, very private character that considers that it is naturally impossible to like other people. So we are here in her voice. Then she goes on at length to say possible exceptions to all the people I dislike are these children. However, we remain in third person narration here. That's the free indirect speech. And it then does shift back to the narrator in the final sentence of the second paragraph, where it says, on these, i.e. on animals, birds, and the like, she would expend her great but pitiable love. Now, that great but pitiable love is the judgment of the narrator. So it is that description of her love is what is letting us know that we are back in the narrator's voice, that we are out of Miss Hare's head, if you like. Now let's look at how these transitions take place. Which of the four options characterizes that best? Is it that A, they set up a pervading dissonance? Now, in order for there to be a pervading dissonance, the transitions would have to be quite jarring, quite rough, quite extreme. And we are, as we saw, quite unconscious when we read it, whether we are seeing things through Miss Hare's perspective or through the narrator's. So this seems too strong. Is it that they alternate predictably? Now, in order for the alternation to be predictable, there would have to be some kind of pattern in which we would be able to know eventually that a change in voice is coming by some form of signal. There isn't a pattern like this here. By the time we've realized it, as we saw with Her Great But Pitiable Love, we are already in the other voice. The shift has already happened. So it is not predictable. So B is out. Is it that they compete for supremacy? They flow into each other, don't they? Both compete and supremacy are too strong a term for what is happening here. So C is out. Finally, they modulate into each other. Now, modulate, a musical term in which the tone changes, is what seems to fit this the best. We saw that the changes are subtle, they are mild, they are distinctly recognizable once you reread the passage looking for the changes, but they modulate into each other in that it is subtle, it is smooth. Therefore, D is your correct answer. And this concludes the ACER Practice Test A walkthrough. Thanks for watching. We hope it's been helpful. Good luck with the GAMSAT. You can do it.